You drag home a massive smart fridge from the big box store, peel off the protective film, and connect the Wi-Fi while feeling like you finally bought a piece of the future. A few years pass until you stop noticing the machine entirely. But then one random morning you find the milk is warm and the freezer smells like a swamp. A technician shows up, listens to the compressor for 10 seconds, and starts dropping expensive phrases like sealed system or control board before landing on the line everyone hates to hear. It is just not worth fixing. We are not here for spooky stories today, so let's trace that failure backward to the specific design choices that made this outcome inevitable. The 5-year pattern and who benefits. When you hear people complain that modern fridges only last 5 years, do not mistake that for some unavoidable law of nature. Some units will run longer while others die much faster. And while certain brands definitely perform better than their competitors, the pattern remains the same across the industry. A refrigerator works just long enough for you to trust it and stop thinking about it. And then the whole thing falls apart right when replacing it feels like a total emergency. Older refrigerators did not live forever because the engineers back then were nicer people or more honest. Those machines lasted because the control logic stayed simple, meaning you had a mechanical thermostat, a basic compressor circuit, and a defrost timer that a human being could actually understand. Because there were fewer sensors, you ran into fewer weird edge cases, and having fewer connectors meant you did not deal with as many bad contacts or fried boards. The typical modern fridge does not run like an appliance anymore. It runs like a networked device. A single printed circuit board takes the temperature readings, drives the fans, manages the compressor, and even talks to your phone. While that sounds high-tech, it actually creates single points of failure that never existed before, because one board now holds the keys to every single function the machine performs. This is exactly where that feeling of paying a diagnostic ransom starts to kick in. When your fridge throws a vague error code, you cannot just translate that into a specific part. And you certainly cannot find a wiring diagram glued to the back panel like the old days. You often end up paying $100 just to get a clear answer on what failed, because the manufacturer gates that information behind service modes and brand-specific tools. Warranties only add to the confusion, especially when the marketing leans so heavily on those long-term compressor guarantees. Many people hear 10-year compressor warranty and assume they have a decade of total protection. But the reality is that coverage often splits into parts only versus labor and sealed system work after the first year. Every brand handles this differently, but that massive gap between what the advertisement implies and what the final invoice says is exactly where consumer trust dies. We are going to investigate the 3 failure paths that keep showing up in my shop. We will look at sealed system failures that effectively total the unit, ice maker designs that fight the laws of physics, and repair barriers that turn a 10-cent fix into a $400 board swap. We have to start with the cooling system, because once the cooling dies, everything inside that box turns into trash on a timer. Pull your fridge away from the wall and ignore those fancy stainless doors for a minute. The real machine lives in the back, tucked away in a sealed loop consisting of the compressor, condenser, evaporator, and the copper tubing that carries refrigerant through the whole house. They call it a sealed system for a reason, and once that loop gets contaminated with moisture or debris, you cannot just swap out a single part like you are fixing a toaster. You are dealing with a system that depends on absolute internal cleanliness, operating at pressures and tolerances you cannot see with the naked eye. Most owners only learn how this works when the cooling stops, and the technician starts talking about totals. They do not usually say your compressor is just weak and needs a quick swap, but instead they use the phrase sealed system problem. A no-cool symptom could mean a dead compressor, a tiny refrigerant leak, or a restriction moving through the lines. And every one of those possibilities pushes the job towards specialized tools and expensive labor. For decades, the industry relied on the rotary compressor, which is a mature motor design that spins to compress refrigerant and uses oil management systems refined over a long time. It is not magic, but it is a proven technology with a track record that repair shops actually understand. Linear compressors sold a different story by promising better efficiency and lower noise, because the piston moves back and forth rather than spinning in a circle. On paper, that design looks great, And while I am not saying every linear unit fails, we can factually state they have been the subject of major class action lawsuits and ongoing legal claims. Failure rates are always argued, depending on who is doing the measuring, but the gap between data and reality is wide. Some retailer service datasets report low single-digit replacement rates over several years, yet consumer surveys and owner reports frequently describe early failures happening in that 2 to 7 year window. When a compressor dies, it can fail clean, or it can fail dirty, and a dirty failure means internal wear has sent metal debris circulating through the entire sealed system. Now, the job is not a simple part swap, because you are looking at flushing the lines, pulling a vacuum, and replacing filter dryers, while hoping the new unit does not die young from whatever junk stayed in the lines. This is where the warranty messaging turns into a trap for your wallet. A parts-only compressor warranty sounds comforting until you realize that sealed system labor is never a screwdriver job, and the cost of refrigerant handling, plus the risk of repeat visits, adds up fast. You do not need a spreadsheet to see the problem when the repair quote starts approaching the price of a brand new machine. This usually happens when the fridge is already a few years old, and most owners cannot risk waiting through weeks of downtime while their food rots. Keep one thought in your pocket, because even if your sealed system survives, a modern fridge can still die from electronics that are even harder to diagnose without the right software access. Even if the cooling system keeps doing its job, you can still get wrecked by a feature that looks harmless on the showroom floor. I am talking about the ice maker sitting up in the fresh food section, hidden right behind a pretty little door at eye level. That design choice was never about making better ice, but was instead about selling floor space and clean lines to people who want a premium badge. You open the freezer and it looks huge because the icebox got pushed upstairs where it is easier to reach. But physics does not care what sells in a brochure. That icebox has to freeze water inside a compartment that is supposed to stay safely above freezing. So the fridge has to route extra cold air up through plastic ducts and pass seals into a small cavity. These systems run on incredibly thin margins, and if the insulation is mediocre or a door seal leaks just a little bit, you do not get a small problem. You get a frost storm. Warm air sneaks in, moisture condenses, and frost grows where it should never be until the icebox turns into one solid frozen lump. The auger motor fights that heavy load until it eventually jams, or the fill tube freezes solid while the unit keeps trying to pump water. Now you are chasing leaks, floor puddles, and ice dams that push water into places it was never meant to go. This is where the failure cascades, because the fans start to strain and the airflow drops until your food starts lasting 2 days instead of 5. You will probably blame the grocery store at first, but then you will notice the back wall of the fridge is sweating or icing up. When this happens, most people do exactly what you would expect, by unplugging the machine and chipping the ice away with a hairdryer. You reset the electronics and the machine behaves for a week, but that is not a real fix. That is just you performing unpaid defrost service because the design depends on perfect sealing in the messiest part of your kitchen. A technician can swap the entire ice maker assembly to buy you some time. But if the root cause is a bad duct layout or air leakage, the treadmill keeps moving and you just keep paying for more laps. Take a step back and look at what you are actually dealing with here. This refrigerator is no longer just a cold box with a motor. It is a computer that happens to have a compressor attached to the bottom. When an old mechanical thermostat fails, it does so in a boring way because it just stops switching, which makes it easy for you to test and replace. A modern control board fails in much more creative ways since it is constantly managing relays, reading sensors, and powering fans based on decisions you cannot see. This leads us to the digital parts pairing trap. Even if you manage to buy the correct replacement board, the fridge might expect a specific digital handshake, and the machine will refuse to behave if that authorization is missing. The part is not actually wrong, it is just unauthorized by the manufacturer. Access is the leverage point they use against you. Service modes, error code maps, and basic documentation are locked behind an authorized service network, which forces independent shops and DIY owners to swap expensive boards based on nothing but guesswork. So what are you supposed to do when you are standing in the appliance aisle and every machine looks exactly the same? The first rule is that fewer features always mean fewer failure paths. Every dispenser, touchscreen, and sensor adds another point where a cheap connector or a stressed circuit board can take the entire fridge down. If you do not use the Wi-Fi features today, you certainly will not use them in year 4 when the app stops updating, but you will still own the hardware that is waiting to fail. The second rule is to treat indoor ice and water as a wear item that you are choosing on purpose. If you want those features, that is fine. But you need to understand that you are buying a water system and motors living inside a warm room. That setup requires constant maintenance, and it is definitely not magic. Before you hand over your credit card, start asking the questions that sales floors absolutely hate to hear. You need to know how long parts will be available, and if the service manual is public. If the compressor has a long warranty, you should ask what exactly stays covered after the first year, because you need to know if the sealed system labor is included or if you will be stuck paying for the most expensive part of the job. If you already have one of these machines in your kitchen, you need to act early. When the temperatures start to drift or the ice maker acts weird, you should document the frost patterns and write down every error code you see. When you finally call for service, you must push for a written diagnosis that names a specific subsystem instead of accepting a shrug and a guess that it might be the board. When you start getting quotes for the work, make sure you compare the full scope of the job. You want the labor, the refrigerant work, and any return visits spelled out in writing, because trial and error repairs become expensive very fast when control boards and sealed system time are on the table. Basic maintenance helps, but only the boring kind that people usually ignore. You have to keep the airflow clear so the condenser can breathe. Check your door gaskets for gaps, and never ignore small leaks from the ice system. Water damage eventually becomes its own massive bill, and while cleaning the coils will not turn a fragile design into a tank, it can stop a minor fault from snowballing into a ransom moment. When you are finally ready to replace the machine, the easiest win is simply refusing the booby-trapped feature set. You should buy the simplest fridge that can keep stable temperatures. Then, spend the money you saved on food, rather than a touchscreen that will die long before the light bulb does. Your fridge is not failing by accident, and those breakdowns are happening exactly where the engineers bake the stress into the design. One weak subsystem triggers a massive repair quote or an unverified electronics swap, which steers you toward buying a new machine because that feels easier than fighting for a real fix. If you want more of these teardown audits, hit subscribe, share this with anyone shopping for appliances, and drop your model and failure in the comments, because these patterns only become clear when we start comparing notes.